You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Hardly any of the founders of the modern conservative movement, in my opinion, are more underappreciated than Frank Meyer. Meyer, if he's talked about at all today, is often acknowledged as being the father or the founder of fusionism. But what exactly that means and why it's important is largely lost to us. My guest in this conversation is Daniel Flynn, whose latest book is literally called The Man Who Invented Conservatism: The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. This is certainly not the first book written by Daniel Flynn, but it's the first in a while that isn't aiming leftward, but is instead taking a serious look at a conservative forefather. Daniel Flynn, of course, is the senior editor at the American Spectator and a columnist for various publications. You can tell in this conversation he really loves his subject matter, who he calls affectionately Frank, and for good reason. If you're a biographer, Frank Meyer had a very interesting life. I mean, short of being just extremely important in the founding of intellectual conservatism in the modern era. Meyer's personal life tells of sexual exploits and intrigue, infiltrating the communist movement as a hardcore communist and then later testifying against them, and working closely with William F. Buckley at National Review in the early days, as well as the multitude of individuals who are incredibly famous that he interacted with just on a daily basis. All this could probably make for a pretty good blockbuster movie. Now, Daniel's book is further aided by the fact that he happened upon an amazing discovery, Meyer's previously unexamined correspondence in an old soda warehouse he located, thousands of records that lend previously undiscovered color and clarity to this remarkable life. So with all that, let's get right to it. Here is my conversation with Daniel Flynn on his new book, The Man Who Invented Conservatism: The Unlikely Life of Frank Meyer.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Daniel, I have to imagine you felt like a biblical scholar having run across the Dead Sea Scrolls clear back when, because one of the most fascinating things about this book, of course, is you discovering this treasure trove of letters from Frank Meyer. So I'm wondering, can we start here? Like, how did that happen? How did you get that lucky?
Well, when I was 4 years old, I used to close my eyes and wish myself invisible when there were uncomfortable situations. And I did something very similar in 2020, 2021, where I closed my eyes and I wished into existence Frank Meyer's papers. And I dreamed this at night. And one day in 2022, I found his papers in a warehouse, an old soda warehouse, an old Pepsi warehouse in Altoona, Pennsylvania. This was after several years of searching. And what led me there was basically desperation that I had done a lot of reading of books and of newspaper articles and things like just bare bones research to know where to look, to know what to ask people in interviews. And then all of a sudden, the whole country shuts down and I can't go to archives. I can't do real research. At the same time, I had done a Freedom of Information Act request with the federal government, and they essentially they got back to me in 2022. They got back to me a year later, and they said, "Well, our requests are now taking about 8 years to process, but since COVID happened, yours is going to take a little longer. In other words, check back with us in the 2030s." And the thing was that at the Hoover Institution, which, full disclosure, I'm a visiting fellow there. It's an awesome place, but Frank's papers out there, they were underwhelming and the rhythm was off. And what I mean by that is that usually when you're doing archival work, and it took me, a few decades to figure out archives, but there's usually things that you expect to be there. What would you keep over the course of a lifetime? You'd certainly keep your tax returns. If you were living in the 20th century, you'd probably keep your letters. And that was missing. And I said to myself, gee, this isn't Frank's papers. Where are Frank's papers? And I set off on a quest to find them, essentially, is what happened.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know from reading George Nash's incredible book, The History of the Intellectual Conservative Movement in the United States of America, um, that Frank Meyer, along with, say, Wilmore Kendall, were the two people that popped that I was like, man, I wished I could have met these people. They were just such characters.
I don't know that you'd like to have met Kendall. I should say about the collection that I found, and it took a couple years to find. Ultimately, the most exciting letters, I think, are probably from Wilmore Kendall, and there are about 1,000 of those letters there. Those are the most gossipy. The most sort of philosophically exciting are from Rose Wilder Lane. And so it depends what mood you're in. If you want to hear someone dish dirt, well, read Kendall's letters. And if you want to challenge yourself, read Rose Wilder Lane's. Kendall's letters, Kendall and Meyer were very tight for almost about 10 years. And one of the things that I found in the book that I don't think either Frank Meyer knew or Wilmer Kendall knew is that their paths crossed actually in England. And
Wow.
Kendall had written a very descriptive letter about this young communist dressing down H.G. Wells at Oxford, and he was, of course, describing Frank Meyer. He just didn't know he was describing him, and he wrote a very long letter to his father about this guy and about how crazy he was and this kind of thing. And so they actually had met, or at least they were in the same room so many years earlier. But from 55 to 64 or so, they were very tight and it fell apart. And when I say Kendall's letters are the most kind of descriptive to Meyer, they are they're colorful in the sense that he has this trademark green ink, but they're colorful because he's saying things to Meyer like, I'm sorry I didn't get you that book review, but this time I didn't have a good excuse. Do you remember that 19-year-old co-ed I told you about? Well, she showed up at my door again, and this time I didn't turn her away. And so that's the thing that you're going to find here that you can't find in any other book because these letters have been sitting for 70 years. Nobody has seen them. And Kendall is going to say that kind of thing to his friend Meyer. He's not going to say it to Bill Buckley, who was his boss and who he had mentored at Yale. And speaking of which, I mean, there's a certain point that Kendall and Buckley have a falling out. One of the most dramatic letters in the whole collection, Kendall is writing to Elsie Meyer and saying, you say that I have had a falling out with all my friends. I don't know any of my friends that I'm currently in a quarrel with other than one Frank S. Meyer. If you're referring to Bill Buckley, nobody has heard me call him a friend for at least 5 years. Bill Buckley is not my friend. Bill Buckley is my enemy. And essentially says something like that. And so it's very dramatic, that relationship just falling apart. And that's kind of what the book is about. The book's a little bit about fusionism, certainly, but it's really about friendship. And it's about friendships
Mm.
and betrayals and feuds and fights, loyalty, all the sort of things that you think about with friendship. Because Frank was a guy who made a lot of friends, and I think it's not surprising that he came up with this idea of fusionism because really what that was trying to make friends, trying to make allies of people that prior to him coming along, that people thought, well, the traditionalists and the libertarians, they have nothing in common. And Frank said, no, you do have everything in common. You guys should be on the same team.
Yeah, and I obviously want to talk about fusionism. I mean, you can't have a conversation about Frank Meyer without delving into that at some point. But before we get there, and incidentally, I want to meet. I wished I could have met Meyer and Wilmore Kendall for really different reasons. I mean, Kendall just seems so prickly. I almost want to bear witness. Not so much I would envision myself having a chummy conversation with him, but Meyer himself could be maybe not prickly, but certainly could calls a spade a spade. What was it? Principles and Heresy, I think, was his
Principles and
long running
heresies was the
essay.
yeah, and Neil Freeman, who was a contemporary, or at least was a younger contemporary of some of these guys, was a great confidant of Bill Buckley for decades. At a certain point, I asked him about them, and I interviewed, and he called Meyer, Brent Bazell, and Wilmore Kendall unclubbable men. That the three of them, in different ways, were unclubbable. They were not guys that were going to be chummy, or I mean, they could be chummy, but if you had them around a water cooler in an office, it would be over. And it was a good thing for National Review that Frank was essentially the first telecommuter. He was writing from Woodstock, New York. He wasn't coming into the office so much. Kendall and Bazell eventually go over to Spain. And that's probably, in some ways, it's bad for the magazine, but in other ways, it's sort of good because these guys are argumentative. And I think ultimately, Kendall is someone who lost almost all of his friends because he
Mm-hmm.
was feuding with them all. he probably nowadays you'd say, well, this guy had a personality disorder. Brent Bizzell, we find out later, had some type of a mental illness. He's a brilliant guy, but I don't know how these things come about, but he developed some kind of a mental illness. And then Frank is this guy that, never saw an argument he didn't want to get in. And so you can see how having them around the office might not have been good for National Review, and people would have thought of them as kind of pains in the neck. However, that spark, that amazing thing that was National Review for, say, the first 7 or 8 years, those three guys, they're the ingredients of it.
Well, and I would argue the maybe the missing ingredient to what you're saying, of course, is Buckley himself, who was the exact opposite of what you're describing. The only individual that maybe could have held this ragtag group of feuding friends together.
Well, that's pretty much precisely what Neil Freeman said, is that Buckley's real talent was to sort of be the orchestra, to be the band leader, to get everyone in harmony, to get people that were discordant in harmony. And that was, he said, this was his real overlooked talent. And I do think that's what Buckley's talent was, to get all these people on the same page in the same magazine, that in some ways these people were at each other's throats. And I think in The Man Who Invented Conservatism, the thing that you're going to see that you're not going to see from other books is just how much behind the scenes some of these guys disliked one another.
Yeah, yeah, and that's incredible. And you mentioned, of course, that Meyer is in some ways the first telecommuter, if you will, or at least for National Review, and that is something that I mean, George Nash talks about this in his book, and I've heard this so often. The tendency of this guy to call people at 2, 3 in the morning with these long phone calls. And I think Matt Sidman had posted to Twitter the other day that your book is the first one that actually gives us, everybody's heard this, but now we actually see things like the guy's phone bill and just the
Yes.
insane amount of what was it, 25% of his annual income in some cases was going just to the phone bill?
Yes. And I essentially, when he leaves the Communist Party, not without reason, he thinks that these people might try to harm me. I mean, Frank was a star witness at the longest, most expensive trial in the history of the United States, the Smith Act trial in 1948, 1949. He was one of 5 witnesses who was actually a communist. You had all these other witnesses that were kind of FBI informants and people like that. Frank was an earnest communist. And the communists occasionally did murder people. I mean, they did a lot overseas. Americans, not so much, but they did kill some Americans. And so, not without reason, Frank gets a gun and he starts staying up all night. And at the same time, when he comes over to the conservative side, atop these nocturnal habits, he is starts to call people more and more, and it shows up on his taxes, his phone bills, and things like that, to such a degree that in many of these years he was paying a quarter of his income in telephone bills. It got so bad that Brent Bizzell and him probably called each other the most, at least in the early 1960s. They wrote up a contract saying Meyer's not to call collect, Meyer's not to call, he's not to expect him to call him back at these hours. And it was a big joke for everyone, Frank being AT&T's best customer. But it, if you got a call from Frank Meyer at 2 in the morning the first time, but if you were a younger person, you might initially be flattered. But the third or fourth time, you might not be. But those were Frank's hours. Frank got up in the late afternoon. He went to bed in the early morning, and he stayed up all night working. Or if he had company, talking, drinking, smoking, eating, holding court.
It fascinates me the degree to which some of the founding fathers, if you will, of the early conservative movement were in their younger days radical Marxists. I mean, certainly Frank Meyer, but also Whittaker Chambers, Wilmore Kendall. I mean, heck, to a certain degree, Thomas Sowell, maybe not a dedicated Marxist in the sense of like a party apparatus, but certainly he had that underlying philosophy. And it's interesting to me that Frank Meyer had a very similar approach as Whittaker Chambers when he broke, in that they both feared, again, as you suggest, probably rightly so, feared for their life, and in a lot of ways almost went underground. And I'm wondering though, what was it that drew initially? Because it's not as if Frank Meyer grew up in, say, a Bolshevik home. Like, what turns him from a normal American, say, or raised in a Jewish family, normal American, to a radical Marxist that is not only taken with Marx's ideas, but literally is advocating the violent overthrow of Western governments.
Well, I think initially it was a rebellion. I have a essay from him when he was 14, the first known piece of writing from Frank Meyer. He wrote in defense of Reform Judaism, and he said, "You know, people who think that religion is dying, come to the temple on these holy days. You'll see all these people in there," and it's a real robust defense. And 2 years later, I have an award-winning essay he wrote at Newark Academy, which was the kind of the fancy prep school he went to. And in that essay, he's defending Bolsheviks, he's defending atheists. So something happened between the ages of 14 and 16. And my interpretation of it is that it's a standard teenage rebellion. His father was a capitalist. His father had a company a very successful company that sold raincoats. And his mother came from a wealthy family, but her interests in life were basically volunteering and donating to Jewish charitable causes. And so he rebelled against his mother's religion and he rebelled against his father's capitalism. At Princeton, he endured a great deal of anti-Semitism, particularly in admissions. I mean, there's an amazing series of letters that I have between the director of admissions at Princeton and the headmaster of his prep school, where the director of admissions is saying, "Listen, we have plenty of fine, clean-cut Christian Americans who are applying. Why do we have to give the spot to this guy who doesn't even look like a Hebrew of the better type?" And
Hmm.
so there's all this obsession over his religion, and they don't allow him to go to the school. Frank stays for next year in prep school, and he goes to Princeton. But you have to wonder whether the student body was sort of infected by the anti-Semitism of the people running the place. And so Frank kind of washes out after about a year and a half, and he does something very Frank Meyerish, which is he doesn't go to the University of Wisconsin. He doesn't go to, some second tier school in the United States. He gets into Balliol College, Oxford. So he leaves Princeton and he goes he instead of going to a smaller school, a school that wasn't as academically, didn't have that kind of reputation. He went to a better school. He went to Oxford, and it's at Oxford that Frank really gets heavily involved in communism. He is the founder of something called the October Club, which when Frank got to Oxford, there were zero communists in the student body, and when he left there were over 300 members of this communist group. Frank becomes the director of the student bureau of the Communist Party of Great Britain. He is almost immediately a member of the board of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which they didn't have a lot of people on their board. So the idea of a 22, 23-year-old guy on their board, that's kind of crazy. And the fact that he's an American. So all this time, very quickly within a month of Frank starting the October Club, MI5, later MI6, other intelligence agencies, police agencies, they're following Frank. They're taking notes. They're saying, I know, they know where his mother banks. They know what kind of tweed jacket he wears. They know what women he's hanging out with. They know what bars he drinks at. They do a black bag job on his apartment. They put a mail cover on his correspondence. They know all this stuff about him. But in the 160 or so pages of British intelligence notes that I have, the one thing that they leave out is that Frank Meyer, for almost all the time that he's in England, where he's calling for the violent overthrow of the government of Ramsay MacDonald, the prime minister, he is surreptitiously having an affair with Ramsay MacDonald's youngest daughter. This is the kind of brashness of Frank Meyer that, think about this. I mean, all these romantic figures in the history of communism, Jack Reed or Che Guevara, did they ever do something as daring as this caper? The idea that you're going to be out there vocally calling for the violent overthrow of the government of the prime minister and date the prime minister's daughter. I have a letter from her that I found in this warehouse, and we talked about the warehouse a little bit before, but essentially, I found 15 boxes. There were 663 boxes, and of those 663 that I went through over 3 days, 15 of them had Frank Meyer's papers, and it took me 19 months to go through and transcribe the relevant portions. I read every last document, probably something close to 250,000 documents in there. One of the more valuable letters from a scholarly perspective is from Sheila MacDonald, the prime minister's daughter. And she says, "Listen, Frank, my dad's gone. Nobody's here. The coast is clear. Why don't you come over and have dinner at 10 Downing Street tonight?" And that's amazing to me that he's on a list to be followed, and at the same time he's going to 10 Downing Street to meet the prime minister's daughter. they don't take notes of this. I don't believe that they didn't know that this was going
Yeah, I
on.
was about to ask, is it a matter of they just deliberately didn't record that?
Oh, it's kind of an embarrassing thing. What are you going to say? He's dating the prime minister's daughter.
Right.
I think how they handled it was, they deport him from the country in June of 1934. Frank becomes a cause célèbre. The stated reason is because he basically gets kicked out of London School of Economics. They had slandered or libeled a professor there, and Frank was the president of the student body in the student government. He was made there because they fixed the election. A guy named Christian Menon, who later became the second most powerful man in India, he fixed the election for Frank, and Frank loses that spot. He's an aide to Bronislaw Malinowski. He loses that spot. He has a Rockefeller Foundation money that's coming to him. He loses that. And the London School of Economics is fed up with him. They go to the Home Office and say, listen, this guy is not a student here. He has no job. He has no reason to be in the United Kingdom. Get him out of here. And there, at that point, there kicks off this humongous debate in England where you have Clement Attlee, the future prime minister, defending Frank Meyer on the floor of Parliament. You have other members of Parliament saying, get him out of the country. There's a petition, naturally, that says keep Frank Meyer in the country.
Mm-hmm.
E.M. Forster, the author of Passage to India, Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher, the Dean of Canterbury, all these people are signing this petition saying keep Frank Meyer here. Michael Straight, who later was the publisher of the New Republic, he wrote in his memoirs about marching around London with a whole group of students chanting, Free Frank Meyer, Free Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer became a cause célèbre. And at a certain point, Sheila MacDonald, the prime minister's daughter, writes him and says, listen, if there's anything I can do, let me know. You know, there's nothing she can do because I think, in my mind, part of the reason he gets kicked out is because of her. Now, there's no evidence for that other than I have these letters and I know that they dated, but the intelligence agency said nothing of the relationship. Maybe that's material that they just declined to, declassify. I don't know. Or perhaps they didn't see it. I just find it hard to believe they didn't see it. Nevertheless, he gets kicked out of England. He gets deported, and he never goes back.
Yeah, man, the guy had chutzpah, right? I mean, good grief. That's crazy. So he's back in the United States,
Well,
and
before
he's.
he gets back in the United States, he
Mhm.
works for a guy in France named Walter Ulbricht. Walter Ulbricht, like Christian Menon and others that crossed Frank Meyer's path, later became a rather significant figure in history. He's the longest serving dictator in the history of East Germany. He is the guy that puts up the Berlin Wall. Frank is directly working for him in France under peace work.
Mm,
Walter Ulbricht had already ordered murders of people, and he is in charge of this peace work, and Frank is working for him. And when Frank goes back to the United States, he is still under discipline, working for Walter Ulbricht for a series of months. He goes back to the United States. What's interesting about that is that he's a important person in the Communist Party, in the above ground Communist Party, but it's never really until his last years as a communist in the United States that he ever regains the stature that he had in England. Right off the bat in England, he was a big shot, but it took him almost a decade to be a big shot in the American Communist Party. He was sort of a high level manager, but he wasn't a big shot. His last couple of years or last year or so, he certainly was a big shot. He became kind of a confidant of Earl Browder, the head of the Communist Party. And the way he becomes a confidant of him is he writes him a letter and says, listen, if you want to get bowlers into our party and not just these hardcore Marxists, we need to fuse the American tradition with Marxism. And we need to do this not just on the 4th of July, we need to do this every day of the year. And so that word, fusion, fuse, that comes back obviously later in Frank Meyer's life. The whole template of fusing something with the American tradition, that comes back later. And right there in 1943, 1944, these conversations that Frank has with Louis Budens as he's recuperating. He had been in the army, Frank, and kind of washed out of the army. And he's thinking about, how do we save the Communist Party? And part of him, he wants to leave, but his way of saving it is to tether it to America, to tether Marxism to America. Now, Frank was a bright guy. He was an ideologue, but he was a bright guy. At some point, the thought was going to occur to him, Marxism has nothing to do with the American tradition. And at that point, he's asking himself, what does? And that leads the intellectual journey that he has for the rest of his life. Shortly before his exit, he writes a very peculiar book review for the New Masses, which was a communist publication. And the New Masses, this was a review of The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. You're never going to get a good review of a libertarian or free market or conservative thinker in the New Masses. But somehow, in this very strange time in the Communist Party, when there was a little bit more freedom, Frank wrote what was not exactly a positive review. We'll call it a mixed review. And he gave Hayek, who he knew at the London School of Economics, he gave him a great deal of deference and respect. And reading the review, you can almost see Frank Meyer, discarding himself of these communist Marxist ideas and embracing these new ideas, the ideas of Hayek, these free market ideas.
So is that because I know that, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many founders of the conservative movement that start off as dedicated Marxists. They all seem to have their own story as to what it was that led them out of there. I mean, Wilmore Kendall famously talked about, "I heard a scream," or that's what he says. Something pings your soul or your conscience. In spite of reading Witness, I never got an extremely clear sense what was the moment or the actual thing that let him out. I know that others, it was Stalin denouncing Trotsky, or the great purges. Of course, if I'm not mistaken, Meyer himself was a Stalinist, so maybe that didn't do it so much. But was it in fact? And I understand this can be like a little piece at a time. There may not have been just one moment, but is it Hayek's The Road to Serfdom is the chief thing that gets credited for what starts Meyer to truly question the Marxist ideology?
I don't think that's the chief thing. It's certainly not the first thing. It's just one of about six or seven things. I think the first thing that happens, or one of the first things that happened, is Meyer tried to sign up for World War II. He wanted to fight Nazism. And of course, the Communist Party, they were exhorting everyone, Americans, to go and fight the Nazis at this point because they were no longer allies with the Nazis. And Frank thought, okay, I'll go. And they said, no, 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 you stay here. You're too valuable here. And Frank thought it was very strange that they were telling everyone, they're saying one thing, but doing another, keeping communists from joining the military, at least valuable communists, and telling everyone else, oh, let's sign up and fight. There's a crack in the armor there. I think the biggest crack in the armor happened when he went into the army and he saw that the proletariat, these guys sharing a squad bay, they were not the proletariat that Marx had talked about. These, bricklayers and assembly line workers, they were not the workers of Marx's fantasy. They were very different. And Frank thought, oh, wait a second, because Frank led a very socially insulated life. He grew up in a high hat hotel in Newark, New Jersey. He went to Balliol College. His mother's family was very wealthy. Father created a lot of wealth. So he had a lot of social insulation. And when he was around regular guys, he realized that they were not ready to, they were not incipient revolutionists or anything like that. And that was a shock to him. The real big thing that happened, well, I mean, the catalyst, or the straw that broke the camel's back, is something called the Duclos letter, which at the very end of World War II, in May of 1945, there's a letter from the French communist leader Jacques Duclos questioning the American cooperation with Roosevelt, cooperation with the capitalists, and this sort of go along to get along nature of them, and then the fact that they ceased being a party, they became a communist political association. And Frank and Earl Browder, who was the head of the Communist Party, thought that this was a letter from France. It wasn't. It was a letter from Moscow. It just had a French guy's name on it to kind of
Mm.
mask. And
Hmm.
once everyone understood this is the Kremlin telling you to do this, most people got in line. But as with other party line shifts, some people did not. So there are some people after the Hitler-Stalin pact that leave.
Right.
Frank did not leave. Frank said it was very few people that left, that they mostly were in New York, but in other parts of the country, there was no discernible shift in the number of members during the Nazi pact. There was a drop in mainstream support. The mainstream left thought these people were pariahs. So the party was certainly hurt, but as far as membership, it wasn't hurt all that much. Less so with the Duclos letter, but Frank left. Earl Browder gets kicked out. Louis Budens, who's one of Frank's good friends in the party, he was the managing editor of the Daily Worker. It's strange. Frank left in kind of a whimper. Louis Boudin's left with the biggest bang that anyone has ever kind of defected from the Communist Party. He went to St. Patrick's Cathedral the same day that he is on the masthead of the Daily Worker. He goes there, is baptized by Fulton Sheen, who is the most famous Catholic priest in America, baptizes him in front of the media. And this guy that morning, and I believe even the next day, was the managing editor, was the guy who was editing the Daily Worker on the masthead. He had become a Catholic and he renounced communism. Frank didn't do it with that much fanfare. Frank kind of slinked away. He had a 5-year retreat, essentially, where he rethought his views. And by 1950, he emerges clearly as a right winger.
Emerges as a right winger, actively exposing the communists he had very much worked for, right? I mean, that sounds very similar to Whittaker Chambers, this sort of breaks with the Communist Party, then goes underground, thinks it through, and then ultimately ends up testifying. Obviously, there are a lot of differences there. I'm not necessarily trying to draw those parallels, but I guess I'm just saying that he goes from not being a communist to someone who's actively working against the Communist Party.
Chambers did that. I think when I use the word right winger, because I don't think Chambers ever became a right winger. He became a
Right.
conservative of sorts, but he was never kind of fully on board with the National Review project. Meyer was not just fully on board, but he was sort of a purist. He was driving it. He became the commissar that they had wanted him to be in the Communist Party. He sort of became that for the American right. And you see clear signs in early 1950 that it's not that he's a Truman Democrat anymore. He is a right winger. And after, slowly he sort of becomes an anti communist after 1945. He becomes a Truman Democrat. But by 1950, he's something more extreme than that. He is a right winger.
So unpackage that for me for just a little bit, because I think the point could easily be lost on a younger audience today, not as familiar in the differences between, I guess, what we might call Whittaker Chambers. What is that? The Beaconsfield option, or the more moderated position on politics? Like, what does it mean? Because Chambers accuses Meyer of almost Bolshevicizing the conservative movement. Like, what did that mean? What was Chambers concerned or accusing Meyer of doing?
They were friendly, but ultimately, Chambers had his own set of beliefs, which were different from the conservatives. In fact, even his anti-communism clashed with Myers because when National Review caused a big fit because Alger Hiss wanted to get a passport, and they said this guy's a convicted felon. We shouldn't give him a passport. What's he going to do? He's going to flee. Chambers said, just give him a passport. Who cares? um, Khrushchev came to the United States, which at the time was extremely controversial because no Soviet leader had ever come to the United States. And Meyer essentially set up a welcoming committee. I say that sarcastically.
Right.
And Chambers was offended by that because he thought, well, could be a good sign that Khrushchev's coming to the United States. But Meyer, Bazell, and others were ready to give this guy the finger if he'd ever passed them by because they viewed him as a murderer, and that Eisenhower was legitimizing him by having as if like two presidents are meeting or something like that. Oh, this is a murder meeting the elected leader of the free world, and so they found that to be farcical and gross. And uh, Khrushchev thought, well, this is a good step. So they disagreed on a number of things. Chambers only sort of reluctantly joined National Review.
Right.
He, years
Bill Buckley
earlier,
spent a long time trying to court him.
really that he did. But what's unknown, and it's not like I don't say this in the book, but a few, before National Review was even founded, there was a big conference of conservatives. There was going to be 12 of them, like the 12 apostles or something. They were going to meet. I think this was in 53. And at a certain point, Buckley was on the list and Chambers was on the list, and Chambers informed people that he wouldn't go if Buckley was there. So Buckley, when he's a 27, 28-year-old guy, does not have the gravitas, is thought of as kind of an upstart. Even a guy like Chambers, he rubbed him the wrong way. But over time, they became incredibly close. Close, in fact. I have a letter from Priscilla Buckley where she says, I have never seen my brother cry as much as he cried when Whittaker Chambers passed away, even at my dad's funeral. So they became incredibly close. But where they started was, I guess they started at a place where Chambers had an impression of Buckley. But then when he met Buckley being so charming, so intelligent, he was certainly won over by him. with Meyer and Bazell and others, I don't know that he was won over by them. He had a kinship with Meyer. They both had the same experience in a sense. I mean, obviously Chambers is in the below ground, the spy party, and Meyer is in the above ground, the legal party. But wise, they had a lot of things in common, and they knew a lot of the same people, and they went through the same experience, presumably, of clutching a gun in fear. And there's not
Yeah.
a lot of those people that could have said that they did that. So they did have a connection, but at the same time, Chambers kind of found Meyer annoying in some ways, and Meyer found him to be a pain in the neck as well. Like he would not turn in reviews on time, and he'd just sort of write whenever he would write. And obviously, the review of the Ayn Rand Atlas Shrugged, I don't know, it's not like Meyer was a fan of Ayn Rand, but that particular review, that created a lot of fissures and problems for Meyer and problems for the magazine. It was typical Chambers in the sense that it was written beautifully and in a poetic sense, A plus, but in a substantive sense, um, I don't know that he gets everything right. It was certainly overstated, and he could be a person who overstated things, but got the prose of it all, the poetry of it all in a beautiful way. At least in my opinion, Chambers did.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little earlier. I want to bring us back here because there's a lot of names in those early days of National Review: Wilmore Kendall, Chambers, Bozell, Berman. But in my opinion, I think that Frank Meyer and William F. Buckley are the two individuals who possibly did more to shepherd that early National Review Young Conservative movement more than the others, in that Buckley is the one that held everyone together. He was the glue, right? The magnanimous personality that could work with all these people. But it was really Meyer that, through trial and error, developed this sort of, I guess, what we referred to earlier as fusionism, even though I know that wasn't his term. That was Brent Bozell's characterization
Oh no, that
of it.
was Meyer's term. That was Meyer's term.
It was. I always thought Brent Bozell had labeled it that way.
Well, I think by the time Bazell was labeling it that, Meyer had probably been sick of the term, but Meyer uses the term in the Communist Party. He uses the term in the American Mercury in the early 1950s. He uses the term a number of places. I think probably by the 1960s, he might be sick of it, or he doesn't like the fact that people are throwing that label on his beliefs, but that's the term he used. So I don't know that Meyer could rightfully complain. I know that's a lot has been made of the point that you just made. However, I don't really find a lot of evidence to kind of back that up, at least for my book. Meyer used the term, so how
Hmm.
can anyone say, well, Meyer didn't want that term to be used? Well, he used it himself.
Well, I did not know that. I appreciate you enlightening me. I know that when Bozell used it, he certainly used it as a
It's an insult, yeah.
as an insult. Right, right. He was trying to
To
discredit the
ridicule it.
idea.
And,
But
and maybe at that point Meyer was sick of the term, but certainly Bazell used it that way. Sure, yeah.
So, and before I get too far in the weeds here, because for the listeners saying, what are you guys talking about? We should probably at least define some terms. Before I when I was introduced to you in this book, and I had reached out to you email, before I did any of that, I emailed Stephanie Slade, who's the great apostle of our time, of guess of the fusionist
Yes.
idea that Myers
And she
accosted.
has an exciting book that I think is going to come out next year.
I am definitely looking forward to reading it, and I'm hoping to get her back on the podcast to talk about that. But I trust her interpretation, say, of fusionism. And so I reached out to her to just say, because I, quite frankly, didn't know that much about you. And I said, hey, what do you think about Daniel Flynn's views on Meyer or something? And she had nothing but praise for your new book, said, no, he's
Nice.
right on course. And no, she was very flattering in the book, and it got me excited to speak with you. And then, of course, when I read the articles you'd written, and like, oh, wow, yeah, this guy knows his stuff. Bear in mind, Stephanie Slade might listen to this, so don't don't mess it up. But how would you define, for the average person just stepping into this conversation, like what is fusionism?
At distilled level, fusionism, and this is at simplistic level, that if you're a conservative, let's say in Italy, you might want to conserve the Catholic Church. If you're a conservative in the United States, you might want to conserve the thing that's unique about us is the American founding. That's what's unique about our country. And what's special about the founding is freedom. So our tradition is the founding. Whatever you want to throw into the founding, the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, the Declaration, Washington's farewell address, whatever you think goes in that box of the founding, you throw it in there. What's unique about those things is freedom. That's the sort of underlying current of it all, and that's what was special, making that different from everything else that was going on in the world in 1789 and 1776, all that kind of thing. So that's freedom. That's where you get the marriage of liberty and tradition, of traditionalists and liberty. Now, it gets more complex than that. I think one of Meyer's acolytes was a guy named Stan Evans, and Stan wrote a book in the 90s called The Theme is Freedom. That was kind of fusionism applied. And the gist of that book is that freedom rests upon thousands of years of Western civilization. In other words, take away the tradition of the West, and freedom's not going to have a leg to stand on. So, freedom and the point there is that freedom and tradition are not in conflict, but they're in cooperation. And so that's a little bit more of a complex view of fusionism. And then, for some people, fusionism was basically anything that Frank Meyer said. And so if you think fusionism and anything Frank Meyer said, then well, everything that's in defense of freedom is fusionist too. But I like to stick to the more cleaner, simpler version. I think the reason why fusionism served as the default philosophy of the American right, let's say from Goldwater well through Ronald Reagan, why it lasted so long, why it elected conservatives to high office, is that it was simple, that at its base level it was true, that the tradition of America is freedom, and three, that it was utilitarian, that it had a purpose, it had it helped to take two groups, people that were into virtue and tradition and that kind of thing, and people that were into liberty that might not normally see themselves as having a unity of interest. And Frank brought them together. Most people, I think, fixate on that utilitarian nature of fusionism and think it's just a big construct. When you think about it, it's not at all, because that the most basic sense of being a conservative, like I said, if you're in England, you might want to conserve the monarchy. If you're a conservative, you might want to conserve fox hunts, or the aristocracy, or bad dentistry, or whatever it is in England that makes people English.
Right.
In the United States, what you would conserve is the American founding, clearly. And so, even if we move away from fusionism as conservatives, we're ultimately going to get brought back. Just the very definition of the word conservative. If we're American conservatives, what are we going to conserve? And I think the reason that fusionism became very popular, and maybe something like that Russell Kirk's book, The Conservative Mind, is because fusionism had kind of political application. The Conservative Mind was a beautiful book.
Yeah.
And the second
Very
reason is that
little political application.
very little, but a lot of application for how you sort of govern yourself, and how intellectually how you see things.
Hmm.
Uh, but the second thing about it is that this was Conservative Mind was a book talking about Coleridge and Burke and all these people that aren't Americans. Frank's fusionism was a star-spangled political philosophy. It was red, white, and blue, and I think part of the reason he was so successful with it was for that reason.
Yeah, I think what you just said would satisfy, at the very least, Stephanie Slade, because of course, one of her big bugaboo's is that, as you correctly identify there, a lot of people emphasize or overemphasize the utility portion of fusionism, right? Because sometimes when a person's, and depending on how we're defining terms, I suppose it's okay. Sometimes when a person says fusionism, what they really mean is the political project of trying to put together different coalitions into the right. And at that point in time, of course, you had your traditionalists, your libertarians. What Meyer was, if I'm not mistaken, what Meyer was very much saying was like, I mean, that's good as utility, but he was actually arguing there are philosophical alignments between
Correct.
liberty and tradition.
That they were supportive of one another, and that you couldn't have something like virtue without freedom, because compulsory virtue isn't virtue at all. I just a few weeks ago came back from Spain, and of course, two of Meyer's best friends were living in Spain for several years in the 1950s and 1960s, Wilmer Kendall and Brent Bazell. The letters that I got, basically that made up this book. So the letters that I got, one of the reviewers said the letters in that warehouse, they made up 43% of the man who invented conservatism, the source citation. So a huge part of this book is those letters. And one of the more exciting parts of the letters is from Brent Bazell when he's in Spain, or he's saying to Meyer, listen, the United States is no longer fit to save the West. It's defeated. The only country fit to save the West is Spain. And guess what? I no longer want to be president of the United States. I want to be Cadillo of Spain. You need to get over here. You need to come over with us to this project. And Moore is a little bit more practical minded and says, well, what do you suppose we do about National Review? Is there going to be like a auxiliary in Kent, Connecticut that James Burnham's going to be our United States correspondent? What about money? How am I supposed to make over there? I'm supposed to uproot my family and go to Spain. And he finds all this kind of amusing. And to some degree, Bazell was, being amusing himself deliberately. But he also believed this. And so at that point, you see kind of a crack in the armor where Bazell, who had previously written The Conscience of a Conservative, which was very much, this is the Barry Goldwater's best-selling political
It's
book.
very libertarian.
Very libertarian, very much a Frank Meyer, National Review, Bill Buckley style kind of American conservatism. That's what that book represented. By the time Bazell goes to Spain very quickly. He becomes, I don't know what you call him, like a theocon, or his views change dramatically. And in 1961, he's writing Meyer, and this is another thing that you're not going to get anywhere else because these are letters that I have that haven't been seen, where Bazell is saying, "I'm afraid that Barry Goldwater is our Frankenstein." That they were afraid that they had created a monster that was going to come back to bite them because they felt that Goldwater was going soft on Social Security and other issues that he had sort of made rapprochement with the New Deal. And so that lasted for a while, and I think people don't realize the extent that there were misgivings within National Review about Barry Goldwater, like some big conversations about, should we dump this guy? Bill Rusher, Frank Meyer, two of his biggest supporters having these conversations. Now, by the time you get to 1964, Frank Meyer is so all in on Goldwater that, a couple months before the election, he's predicting, maybe we'll have a landslide, that Goldwater will win a landslide. Of course, they got the
We did have a
landslide.
landslide.
That's right. That's right. It just was the wrong guy that had the landslide.
Wow. So, of course, George Nash makes a big deal in his book, and Nash isn't the only one to do this, but that the two leading voices to kind of poke holes in, say, Meyer's fusionism was Brent Bozell, of course, from the theocratic, or in other words, arguing the no, virtue comes before liberty. On the other side, Murray Rothbard, nope, liberty comes before virtue. And I find that interesting because even today, it's not an entirely settled question, but Nash goes on to essentially declare, as you've kind of suggested, under Goldwater and certainly under Reagan, that ultimately Frank Meyer's view wins the argument largely within the right.
Of course. There's of course you meet people on the right that are Catholic traditionalists. There are those people out there, but there's no political resonance for that. There's no move, political movement that's going to elect a president based on those people. You're going to meet people that are extremely libertarian. I don't know that they could elect someone to run the Libertarian Party. They'd be fighting so much, doing their own freedom, libertarian type things, that they have enough time sort of keeping order in their own convention. So those guys, Rothbard and Bazell, they certainly inspired people. And this isn't to say they're wrong or anything like that. It's just to say that they didn't have any sort of political. There was really no political results favorable to them that came about because of their views. Whereas Meyer, very easily you can say, well, his views elected a president. And Reagan, of course, when he spoke at CPAC in 1981, he talked about Meyer. He stopped and talked about Meyer more than any other conservative thinker, and talked about him sort of creating the sort of the at least the theoretical framework of modern conservatism. And I think that was a correct nod and a hat tip to Meyer. And Meyer, of course, the moment Goldwater loses in 1964, he's moved on and he's seen the future. And the future to him is Ronald Reagan. There's a great memo that I almost print in full in the book. And it's a 7-point memo by Meyer in 1960, in which he tells the other board members of National Review, tells the editors, that under no circumstances are we to endorse Richard Nixon this year, or Nelson Rockefeller should he get the nomination. Um, there's no one suitable for president. Let's endorse Barry Goldwater, even though he's not a candidate. Let's endorse him, and we'll make it clear that we know he's not a candidate, but that's the only guy that's suitable for us. And it may take us 20 years. It's probably going to take us 20 years before we
Mhm.
elect one of our own president. And of course, what happened? It took 20 years. In
Mhm.
64, Meyer sees Ronald Reagan. He sees a star. I guess it wasn't too hard to do that because he was a star, literally, like in Hollywood. But in 68, he's pushing him to the presidency. There's a letter from Hugh Kenner and Guy Davenport, which were two guys in Meyer's fiefdom in the back of National Review, where they're writing to each other and said, Frank Meyer thinks that Ronald Reagan should be president of the USA with a bunch of exclamation points, like as if that was crazy. And I think to a lot of people in 1968, that might have sounded crazy. But Meyer had the foresight to see that Reagan was the guy to lead the conservatives to their promised land.
Beyond foresight, one thing that Meyer certainly had was charisma, which you write about too, and although you label it in the in Reason magazine, Riz, if I'm not, or what?
The New York Post, yes.
Sorry, that wasn't Reason. That was the New York Post. Thank you. The
And if
guy
you're
had
talking to
Riz.
millennials, Riz should be, maybe that's a Gen Z word, but
It's a Gen Z word. I'm an old millennial too, so I'm a little out of date.
okay. Yeah. So Meyer, we talked, I mean, there's a roster of women that he was with prior to his marriage that, a number of these ladies have Wikipedia pages. And because of the detailed nature of the papers that I found, I know who he lost his virginity to. I know who's on his dance cards at the London School of Economics at certain dances, what songs they danced to. I know his IQ score. I know his phone bills. I mean, there's so much stuff that we know about this guy, but we know his girlfriends and a lot. There's about four of them or so that have Wikipedia pages. I mean, how many women in 1920s, 1930s America have Wikipedia pages? Very few. So Frank had something that women wanted. He also had something that guys were attracted to. The letter that was one of the more shocking letters to me was this letter from this prep school teacher in Pennsylvania, and he writes Meyer. He says, I love those books that you suggested to me. I long to take a cook's tour of this part of the country with you. I love drinking with you. It's so fun, giving toasts and doing all this stuff. Let's hang out. He's basically begging Meyer to be his friend. It's a real sycophantic letter. This is James Michener, the guy who wrote Tales of the South Pacific that became one of the best known plays in American history. He wrote Hawaii and all these other books. I mean, I don't think of him as a great writer, but he certainly was a very popular writer. And here he is before he's famous, begging to be Meyer's friend. And those kind of stories repeat over and over again in The Man Who Invented Conservatism. There were all these people that wanted to be around Meyer. It helps if you want to start a movement to be someone that other people like to be around. Then if you're a guy who talks with marbles in his mouth, you're probably not gonna go anywhere as a leader of a movement. But if you're electric, if you're magnetic, if you light up the room as Meyer did, people are gonna wanna be around you. And I think, I talked to Ed Fulner. I interviewed Ed Fulner, who recently passed away, one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation. And Ed said the one big thing that I took from Frank was that Frank was all about addition and multiplication and not subtraction and division. And that's a strange thing to say because Frank was also all about arguing with people and starting fights and that kind of thing. But he wanted to grow the conservative movement just as he grew, his social life grew because he was friends with all these sorts of people. The reason there's, tens of thousands of letters that are littering this table that I'm at is because Frank knew so many people. He had, and if you want to start a political movement, it helps to be a networker like that. It's helped to be friendly with so many people. And Frank was that. And you can almost look at fusionism as an extension of that, of this guy that's making friends. Fusionism was trying to make friends between these two, not warring groups, but two groups that thought of themselves as having nothing to do with one another.
Do you think, I mean, in the moment we've been talking mostly about history up through the 1980s, say, a lot has happened since then. And there are many voices on the right that would discredit Meyer as being the father of the dead consensus, if you will. And maybe fairer to say not so much that they would discredit Meyer, but Meyer himself has not talked about that much because he was in fact the father of the dead consensus. Is Meyer underrated? Are his arguments truly outdated? Do you defend those arguments today, or what would you say to those who would say, well, that might have worked in the '80s, but that's a consensus that no longer works for us?
I think issues change. I'm not sure that principles do. The fusionism obviously does not have the hold over huge portions of the American right as it once did. That's certainly true. I don't know that that makes it false or less true than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. I think that Meyer is certainly not just an underrated figure, but he's become almost an unknown figure. And I have an interview from Mike Wallace in 1961, and he says to Meyer, I would guess that less than that maybe 1 in 1,000 of my viewers know who you are, but I'm told that Bill Buckley hangs on your editorial advice and that Barry Goldwater solicits your political advice. So I want to know about a guy who the important people look to. Who do the people that we look up to look up to? And that's who Frank Meyer was. Someone that we should know about. There are a lot of books about the Civil War or World War II or about figures like Adolf Hitler or uh, Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. Do we need another biography of any of those guys? I think we could use a biography of someone that we didn't know about, but we should. And it's not like you should because it's important. You should because it's interesting. I mean, this is a guy who lived next door to Bob Dylan in Woodstock in the 1960s, and he talked to Bob Dylan. This is a guy who recruited one of the leading science fiction writers for his section of National Review, the literary section, to review science fiction at a time when everyone was, thought science fiction was like a step above cowboy novels, above, at that rank of professional wrestling or something like that. That it was mocked. He brought in Theodore Sturgeon. Sturgeon's the guy that wrote "Live Long and Prosper" in a script in Star Trek. He's the guy that wrote the episode that I can't do it, but where Nimoy invented this, where Dr. Spock invents this. He wrote that episode. He's the guy who writes the Prime Directive in Star Trek, and he's writing for Frank Meyer in National Review. Frank Meyer is the first person to publish Joan Didion's freelance work. They were dismissing this woman as just some writer for like a woman's magazine. And Frank said, no, she's got talent. Whether you're talking, Frank's life weaves in and out of some of the biggest figures of the 20th century. Leave the National Review part aside, but you have these little vignettes in the book with T.S. Eliot, with H.G. Wells. Of course, his best friend was Eugene O'Neill Jr., and so he got to know Eugene O'Neill, who's the greatest American playwright, obviously by a mile, Nobel Prize winner, Pulitzer Prize winner. And so the life of Frank Meyer, it's not, I think people thought of him as not so much a person, but as a personification of an idea. What I tried to do in this book, what I tried to do in The Man Who Invented Conservatism, is show people that no, Frank was a person. He pops off the page. There's a lot of conservative figures that are kind of what I would call black and white TV set people. They are kind of boring. They
Hmm.
live these black and white lives. James Burnham, who was a profound thinker, the managerial revolution. But to me, guy led a boring life with his wife and his kid in Kent, Connecticut. There are other conservatives, like the two guys we talked about earlier, Whittaker Chambers and Wilmore Kendall. They kind of led technicolor lives. Frank Meyer operated in 3D. And whether it's he's messing around with the prime minister's daughter or he's inviting H.G. Wells to speak in Oxford only so he can denounce him and basically shout him down in front of an audience, he did things a little differently. He's working for the guy who created the Berlin Wall in one generation. And the next generation, he's saying, tear down this wall, Mr. Khrushchev. Where'd you hear that before? I mean, that's something 25 years later Reagan would say. So Meyer, because he had his tentacles in all these different places, the art world, the Eugene O'Neill, playwright, he's next door neighbors to Bob Dylan. it's not just the politics part that makes him an exciting figure. It's the fact that he sort of weaved a story through the fabric of the 20th century. And I mean, he just had an exciting life. Frank Meyer had an exciting life in the way that some of these other guys did not.
Well, the name of the book, The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer, is, of course, a really audacious title. But I hope it's evident to the listener at this point that the book would live up to that title just from the snips you've given us. I will, of course, link to that in the show note. I would very much encourage the audience to purchase the book. I love the fact there's a treasure trove of letters that no one has ever encountered before, that we get to see the full color, the technicolor, I guess, if you will, of this man's life. With that, Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the Saving Elves program and sharing with us this fascinating story about this interesting individual.
Outstanding. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.